Good morning. My name is Terry Matthews. I was among the group of 10 people from our church that traveled on a people-to-people trip to Cuba in April this year. And we'd just like to tell you a bit about what we saw, who we saw, and our general impressions of the people of Cuba. We started at the National Hotel in Havana, which was designed by an American architect and built in 1930. It's owned by the government, as are all the tour buses, and all the tour guides are employed by the government. So I'm not sure what President Trump's thinking in not having any money benefit the military is all about. I don't know how that will change. The scene at the hotel, there's always the classic cars, which are all taxis, coming in and out, as are the tour buses. It's right on the coast, looking out to the Caribbean, and we were greeted with our mimosas at every turn. Mojito. I also keep saying checkers instead of dominoes. It's hard to see in this presentation, but in the background is a photo or a painting of the back of Fidel Castro in front of a crowd. By his preference, he didn't want any images of himself anywhere in the country, and that's pretty much the only one we saw. Our first stop was Revolution Plaza. At the Council of the Ministry is a very large image or depiction of Che, and unlike images of Castro, images of Che are everywhere. He is very revered. And there's a revolutionary square in every major city. Nearby our hotel, about 3 blocks away, is the American Embassy. We walked over there fully expecting to greet a Marine out front, but there was not an American in sight. The flag is flying, but it's not staffed. Sorry. Havana has a large bay, and on either side of the bay are fortresses that were built in the 1700s, one on each side protecting the commerce that was going in and out of the bay. Once again, all the classic cars are taxis, and the only way to own a car in Havana or in Cuba is to have inherited it by somebody that owned it before 1959. There are no car dealerships in Havana, and very few people own a car. First, we toured Old Havana, and this is a mural, the entire side of a street, of how life was in the 1800s with the wealthy sugar plantation owners and tobacco plantation owners and rum makers. And on the opposite side of the street is where those people lived and how it looks today. So it's a mirror image on the street. Those wealthy people were quite irritated by the loud noise of horses and carriages on the cobblestone streets. So the streets around those wealthy homes in Old Havana are wooden bricks, paved with wooden bricks. So it was quieter. All of the moneyed people in Havana left Cuba in 1959. In 1959 was the revolution to socialism. Basic needs are totally provided for at no charge to the Cubans. Basic needs being housing, food, healthcare, and education. Early in the revolution in 1960, there was a panic over the future of Cuba. And Operation Peter Pan Airlift ensued by the Catholic Welfare Bureau, and 14,000 children between the ages of 5 and 10 were just sent out of the country. And you know how the 6 degrees of separation? I was speaking with my friend Cheryl Budzinski about my trip to Cuba, and she made reference to her daughter being married to a Cuban, and I said, "Oh, really?" And I wanted to hear more of the story. And his father was part of the Peter Pan Airlift. In 1960 was the urban reform law. Overnight, 96% of the population had been renters, and they were given by the government, because the government took over all businesses and housing. They were given their ownership of where they lived. So they became owners of their apartment. It's hard to see in this picture. This is a picture of a slide of one of the presentations that we heard, but there really wasn't any pride of ownership. Let's say you lived on the second floor of a 5-story building and the roof started leaking. Well, didn't affect you, so why should you help pay for the roof to be repaired? So that led to the state of decay of buildings all over Cuba. This is a typical street in Havana. The streets are all narrow, the sidewalks are all narrow. You kind of take life into your own hands whenever you move around, and you have to be alert. In 1961 was the nationalization of enterprises, and we went to a ration grocery, I wouldn't call it a grocery store, it's just the ration store. This is, in the center is our tour guide, Milagro, and she explained the system of rationing minimal amounts of foods. Every family has a ration book, and in the book is your birth date and how many people and who's in your family. Milk is only given as non-fat dry milk solids because of the difficulty in transportation of milk, and milk is only given to people under 7 and pregnant women. Fortified cereal is available, but only given to seniors. Each day is posted what is available in what quantities, and beyond what you're given as a ration is the nominal cost of additional quantities. All of the foods are in bulk, and they use recycled containers to distribute the portions to individuals. And the quantity of supply is really minimal, and as far as options go, there's typically only one kind of each thing that you want to buy. One of our outings was to go to a fresh market. In the ration stores and as well as the markets that people have, there's no fresh food. There's no refrigeration, there's no produce, no fruit, no vegetables, no meat in the stores. It's all done at a market. And the 20 of us in our group, 10 people other than our church, that were all like-minded people, we got along great. We took one of the common modes of transportation in Havana, a pedicab, to go to a farmer's market with our assignment from our tour guide to buy something to take to the daycare center that we were going to visit. At the market, there's no refrigeration, nothing's on ice. This was the offering of meat. There's hardly any beef in Cuba. The government owns all the cows, and it's illegal to kill a cow. The array of fruits and vegetables are just amazing throughout Cuba and at the market. Our pedicab driver assisted us. This was my partner Vicki, and she gave us written on a card what item we were supposed to purchase, and he helped us find it and choose a quality selection when we did find it. Remember all the t-shirts that we collected to take with us as gifts to the Cuban people? There were more than 150 that we took. And as an example, all the pedicab drivers were given one of the t-shirts. Then we went to visit the daycare center. If you have a job in Cuba and you become pregnant, you have free maternity leave for 1 year and free daycare until the child is in school. If you did not have a job when you got pregnant, charities provide daycare, and that's the kind that we visited, although it's in high demand and there aren't enough places. We also visited a senior center. In 1959, part of the panic over the future of Cuba, there was a baby boom. So the majority of Cubans are becoming seniors now, and Cuba has the most aging population in all of the Americas. Everywhere we went, we sang and we danced, including the daycare center, or the senior center. The senior center was run by Catholic priests from Philadelphia, just really a charming man. Late in the 90s, and it was expanded when Raul Castro was helping out his ailing brother in 2008, they expanded the concept of workers on their own, and people were able to do something on their own to make money. The photo on the left, we walked by a home, and this woman was selling flowers in her doorway. The upper right picture is in front of a church, and there were women selling candles to take into the church as well as flowers. And the photo on the lower right is Michael and Barbara with one of the women who we gave a Women's Spirit t-shirt to. Just like in other cities, there are entrepreneurs on street corners that came up with something to sell. This one is selling churros. Or street performers in the local plaza. Or a gentleman that put out a couple card tables on a sidewalk and is selling stuff, like paintbrushes and combs and whatnot. And he's got his hand on his dog. And actually, this was one of the last pictures I took because I'm rather frugal and I hate waste, and they serve generous portions in Cuba. So I would always manage to collect something left over to feed the skinny dogs and cats.
I have to tell you about this. By the end of the trip, everybody was passing their leftovers to Nancy, to Terry, in these nice restaurants. We were putting them in bags, wrapping them up in napkins, and she would go out and walk. And I have to tell you, some dogs walked away from her offerings. They didn't like them. But we were very busy gathering up leftovers and feeding any animal that would take the food.
It was only the bread that they didn't eat. Yeah. But the fish and the rice and the vegetables they loved. But I did have a following. But I had one more package to get rid of, and believe it or not, it was lobster. So that dog hit the jackpot. Another one of the opportunities is renting a room in your home. And we talked to people that were visiting Cuba that went through Airbnb to find a place to stay. This is Hemingway's favorite bar that is an attraction in Cuba. And the plazas in Cuba are always full of people. Wi-Fi is intermittent and unreliable, and the best place to get it is in the plazas. It's also, people don't have it in their homes. So they go to the plazas and everybody sits around with their gadgets.
Well, again, I promised Diane Brown that I would talk about the role of the artist in Cuba. It's not like it is here, where we're kind of tangential or often to the side. The artists take a major part in the new Cuban Revolution and society. They feel that they were very much part of the socialist revolution. Terry can explain the slides, but one place we went to was called the Tank in Havana. What the artists in that area of the city did during the time of kind of ruin was that they adopted several blocks, and it was the artists themselves who cleared out all the garbage, because most of the area was a garbage dump. So the artists kind of joined forces, they cleaned up the garbage, they kept the tank, or the water tank, it's the water tank, right? And painted it. The area was just beautiful, beautiful, and very, very much alive. And again, they very much consider themselves to be part of the socialist revolution. The reason the artists like it are, again, you can practice your art. You are provided the essentials of life, and of course then you can have another job if you want one or can get one, or you can sell your art, but you don't have to earn a living like you do in the United States. That's strictly your option. You may practice your art. And the results in this area, again, were a garbage dump to a beautiful, beautiful area that also affected the whole area around it. That were painting and taking stuff out of the garbage and making art of it. And again, setting up little stores and such that they could sell in. This extends all the way from the top, painting and architecture, to visual art, to music, dance, what people are wearing, jewelry.
As I said, we were asked to sing and dance almost everywhere we went. And the venues that we went to that were led by artists tended to people of all ages. Children were dancing, and the areas were also a center for seniors to gather as well. We went to this one place, Jose Fuster. He was an artist that focused on mosaic, and it was a bit overwhelming. Anywhere there was a surface, he created a mosaic. But we had a wonderful meal at his home, and most all of our meals were as a group at a large table. This one was family style, others were plate served entrees. So that was our time in Havana. It was time to hit the road. We went to 2 different cities. Sorry. We went from Havana to Cienfuegos, and then Trinidad, and then back to Havana. Should use the other one. About 95% of my photos were taken from sitting in the jump seat next to the bus driver, and about 95% of the pictures were of the rearview mirror. So the ones that you're gonna see, bear in mind, I was bouncing in the bus and managed to get an image. They aren't always the best photos. In front of us was a truck. They don't have emission controls in Cuba. You might think the picture is blurry, but that's black exhaust. And one of the classic cars. They aren't just in Havana, they're throughout the country. Oxen and carts are used everywhere for transporting anything, building materials, refuse. We also shared the highway with horses and donkeys with carts. Shared the highway with herds of goats that would scamper across the road. This illustrates farming in Cuba today. They use oxen to farm and use a one-row chisel to break the ground. In 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed, all imports to Cuba ceased. They had no oil, they had no fertilizer, they had no pesticides. So overnight, they turned 100% back to organic farming and sustainable agriculture, which they continue today. There was no oil for tractors, no gas for cars. At that time, Castro imported 1.2 million bicycles from China and somehow produced another 500,000 and just distributed them because the buses couldn't run and very few people have cars. And we were told stories of people trying to get to work. If you did get on a bus, they were overcrowded and you might get to work and there'd be a blackout and there wouldn't be any power to do your job at work. The main products of Cuba are sugar cane to make rum and tobacco to make cigars and rice and these are fruit tree farm and vegetables. Larry's son-in-law is Cuban, and I kept asking our tour guide to give me heads up whenever I could find something to buy to take back to him as a gift that was a product of Cuba, and they really don't make anything. I don't think we found anything that said made in Cuba. I did find honey, a plastic bottle of honey, coffee, different foods, but they don't make anything in Cuba. We went to a fruit farm and probably tasted at least 10 fruits that nobody had ever heard of before and sampled them. He also gave us a chunk of honeycomb to enjoy. This was their ripening rack between their roadside stand at the front and their home right behind it. They invited us into their home. This is his daughter preparing a meal. I really wish you could see this better. This is their bedroom. It's a bed, two beds with a rod between the two beds. There might be 10 shirts and 4 pair of pants hanging up there. Compared to we Americans that have storage units. Oh, it's amazing. This was their washing machine. They are master mechanics in Cuba. They keep everything running. They don't order spare parts, they make do. When we arrived in Cienfuegos, this is an example of the scene of the classic car, the tour bus, and the donkey cart on the very narrow streets with very narrow sidewalks. The classic cars, again, are in the smaller towns. It's hard to see in this photo, but the buildings are colorful. The properties are narrow. There's pretty much a doorway and a window opening, and then the next building, which is typically a different color. There's no window panes in Cuba. The openings are all covered with wrought iron, decorative ironwork for security. We passed a general store. Once again, you can see that they have quite a bit of what they have, but the number of things that they have are not very many. We passed an optical center, and you can see in the display case there isn't anything. On the rack there were 3 frames of glasses. Healthcare is free, from primary care to specialty care. There's a modest copayment for prescriptions, a modest copayment for eyewear, free dental care, just available, and we weren't really told that there was much of a wait for anything as well. We passed a shoe repair store. We didn't see the sewing machines or the presses that you see in our shoe repair stores. They pretty much had glue. I'm going to focus on the people, the workers that I observed. There's always a sweeper around the town plazas, and they're always using a homemade broom when they're sweeping. We passed the only kind of Starbucks place that I saw, and this gentleman was roasting the coffee. On one of our walks between touring and dinner, Barbara and I were wandering around Cienfuegos, and we started smelling fresh bread, and the aroma got stronger and stronger, and finally we passed this door and we're just blown away by it. And this gentleman just insisted on giving us a tour and brought us in and showed us his mixers and his proof box and his oven, and I wanted to take a photo, and he goes like this, and I'm like, I didn't mean to offend you, and then he went over to get his hat. Then, rather than having people come to the bakery, there are people on bicycles that go around on a route selling bread on the street. These gentlemen were selling onions and garlic on the street. The most common entree that you find on the street is a pork sandwich. And you may be familiar with the Cuban, but the traditional Cuban sandwich is just roast pork. This is on the street with no ice, no heat. My favorite customer is here out front waiting for something coming his way. This gentleman is pushing a cart with fruits and vegetables. This gentleman had coconuts to crack open upon request and sell. This was a town square with a guy on a horseback coming by, and a worker delivering building materials with his donkey cart. That's a good representation of the surface of the streets that you can see as well. On our walks through those wrought iron grates covering the window openings, I peeked in, and this gentleman in the back of the home was watching TV But when I showed this to Larry's son-in-law, he says, "That's classic, Cuba. All the furniture is pre-1950s. And it's just the way it's just locked in time back to the 1950s.
This is the Writers Union and the Artists Union in Cienfuegos. I also ran into someone who had been to Cuba in the last few days, and they mentioned a hero of theirs, of the revolution, called Camilo Cienfuegos Garraran. And he was named for the city rather than the other way around, but he's a great hero and a very beloved artistic type. He was killed, and I guess therefore he became a hero. But he was also, just like all the other Cuban revolutionaries, you know, big, handsome guy, very well spoken, very well beloved, and he was very much called the hero of the revolution, and very much for the artists. I found a poet who had written about what the revolution gave to him. His name is Nicholas Guillen. I have, let's see, that I came from the hills, but I learned to read, to count. I have that I learned to write, to think, and to laugh. I have that I now have a place to work and earn. I have what I have to eat, and I have, let's see, I have what I had to have, and I have created. Now up there at the Writers Union, there's a guy drawing caricatures over there, and I think Nancy Taylor and Michael Brown were included in those. Out in the glass case in the atrium there, you can see much of the art, including some of the mosaic that we had before. There are tiles. And we have our token communists. Oddly enough, only about 8 to 12% of the people registered as communists in Cuba. The rest are just, you know, themselves voting as Cuban, although they are very much behind Castro's revolution. It is known as Castro's rather than Che's. Again, the Union of Writers and Artists made it clear to us, there's the writer there. The writers get paid the least. Most of them work as professors, just like in the U.S. But they very much believe that part of their role is to speak truth to power. So at least the writer claimed that he often met with the government and had a few things to say or to report, and he did not feel censored as a writer. Also here we toured artists' homes, and again you'll see some fans and tiles and things out in the atrium there. And they had the long narrow doors. There are photographers, artists, printmakers, linen workers. There's a choral group, and we saw dancers. And this is where another trade of artists comes in, and you know, we're all very passionate. So the passion of the artists is absolutely unbelievable. The dancing never stopped. Never stopped. Very warm, alive people.
Michael's on the left. This was the photographer's home on the left. The homes are typically long and narrow, and this is the hallway on the left of the home, and there are no doors or walls other than dividing the rooms. There's divisions, but nothing closing the room off. The photographer's up there on the right, and the linoleum print makers down there on the right. The photographer wore this shirt depicting Obama saying it's time, and they very much want Cuba to be open to the United States. This was a ceramicist that we went to his home. He had a very large business. There were probably 6 artisans working. We also noticed that there was a Mercedes and a BMW in his yard. Some people do well. This gentleman took cupboard doors and carved photographs. You can see the photograph the woman is holding and the carving that he created behind him. His work was just beautiful, and he does shows around the United States, and the least expensive was $5,000. Another featured art in Cuba is linen work and cut work. My husband will display his shirt after a while. And crochet work that Barbara's wearing today, I'm wearing today. We were entertained and interacted with the choral group, and one of the comments that was made was they also tour the United States, but they tend to lose members when they tour. People defect and stay. The dance troupe that we saw perform and interacted with, the leader presented a lecture before the presentation and really impressed upon us the culture of the people of Cuba. In addition to the people with art to sell, the many items that we've referred to, this is a photo of 2 of our maids that were at the boutique hotel where we stayed. And we had to include it because they cautioned our tour guide not to come back before 3 o'clock because they had a lot of work to do. And I know you're not going to be able to see this very well, but they made art out of our pajamas and our shorts and our sandals and our towels and our books and our curling iron. They made people out of anything that was in our room. And it just blew everybody away. And they sat in the courtyard when the bus came back and just grinned as everybody opened the door and just screamed. So they were part of the artists as well. I also wanted to capture some of the workers of Cuba. Again, this is a crappy picture because they were just turning the corner, but it's a dump truck with workers in the back heading off to do whatever kind of job. And these were garbage collectors. 2 of the workers stay in the truck, and one lifts the garbage up to them, and in the truck they're dividing the garbage into recycling. And there's cooking oil delivery. And a beer truck. Not quite the temperature standards that we're accustomed to. And a truck full of bananas. I did miss the flatbed of 6 feet high crates of eggs. This illustrates the general state of buildings. On the left is a dining room, a dining area where people are sitting, and the area right on the other side of the wall doesn't have a roof. There's wooden scaffolding in Cuba. I'm not sure they have the OSHA standards that we do. This is an example of the welding and the ironwork that covers the window openings. And a hardworking carpenter with pretty primitive tools. We're pretty sure that this was an area that was going to be a swimming pool. It was near a resort hotel on the coast. And we went to the coast just for 45 minutes to stick our toes in the Caribbean to say that we did. And we think this is going to be a swimming pool, but the only equipment we saw was a pickaxe and a wheelbarrow. And much of the construction material is brick, and you can see why. the red clay. I mean, they hardly have to do anything to create the bricks from their soil. And they don't have flats with bobcats to deliver the bricks with flats of loads of bricks. They're delivered 2 bricks at a time into a pile, and then when the person needs the brick, they bring over their 10-gallon buckets and pick up 2 bricks at a time to take to where they're building something. A cactus hedge in a neighborhood. Grade school in Cuba is in a room in a neighborhood. They aren't school buildings, and the children walk to school. Depending on how old they are, whether they have a blue tie, a scarf, or a red scarf, they're able to walk home by themselves or not. Education is free through university. In high school, they're tested whether they are more apt or interested in a technical field or university pursuits. After their education, they're required to give 3 years of community service. It could be in the military, or it could be in a social work kind of contribution to the community in their field. Most everybody in Cuba makes $20 a month. Doctors, lawyers, and university professors make $30 a month. One of the homes that we passed by and I peeked in, I'm going to assume this is kind of an aftercare program that this gentleman hosts in his home from the time of the day that we were walking by. We went to a library, and all of the books were really, really old. They do have newspapers, but all of the newspapers and all of the magazines are government owned. While we were at the library, a group of school children came by, and you can see the general state of the library building, which is pretty much falling apart. Roosters are a big deal in Cuba. It's kind of a macho thing. And again, when I showed this photo to Larry's son-in-law, he said, "Oh, that's a little one for cockfighting." It's very warm in Cuba, and it was nice to even see young girls care about their skin and aren't too proud to walk around with a sun umbrella to protect their skin. A common sight and a frequent practice in Cuba is playing dominoes in the street. Again, this is one of those crappy pictures from the front of the bus, but we hardly saw any users of wheelchairs in Cuba, but I don't know where they are because it would be very difficult to get around. At least this street seems to be paved as opposed to cobblestone, but the streets are narrow. The sidewalks are too narrow for a wheelchair, so it has to be in the street. So we often take the Americans with Disabilities Act benefits for granted. We're off to dinner one night. Again, you can see the cobblestone streets and the narrow sidewalks. Nancy twisted her ankle at one point in the trip and if somebody was standing on the sidewalk and you were walking by, she had to step down into the street around them and back up onto the sidewalk. All of the restaurants that we went to are called paladors, and they're in people's homes. Initially, they started out limiting the number of chairs that you could have, but now what I read was it's up to 50, but I think some of the places that we went to had more than 50 seats. But we went past this restaurant several times, and I finally asked the tour guide, "Why isn't anybody in there?" And she said, "That's a government restaurant." and the people support the people-owned restaurants. This was one of our dinners at one of those Paladors. And if you don't think I'm saying that it's in their home, there's a table right next to a bed. I mean, they're literally in their home. But there is a little influence. You can't miss Costco, Kirkland, salt and pepper. I'm not sure what this owner has a connection for, because there's still no commerce between the United States, but Costco's worldwide, so we could have gotten it anywhere. We went to a botanical garden. This is a single banyan tree. We went to a coffee farm, and the PhD that gave a presentation to us explained that coffee plants need both sun and shade, and the shade is provided by Caribbean pines and banana trees, and the banana trees also provide the mulch in the leaves and the fruit and water from the bananas themselves. With climate change, the blooms on the coffee trees used to bloom 3 times a year. Now they only bloom once a year. The beans ripen daily, so they have to be picked daily by hand. And we visited the home of the farmer and his parents. And the farmer illustrated the picking basket and how the laborers are paid $1.20 a day for picking coffee beans all day long. The government collects the harvest every day, and they too welcomed us into their home. This is their home, and it's hard to see, but on the right-hand side of the bag are bags of coffee beans. This was the farmer's parents, very proud to have a photo of Shay in their living room. We had a presentation by a woman to explain the religion of Santeria to us. I know Gary Moore, who does a presentation in December, knows a lot about Santeria. But when she presented, one of our members asked her what her nationality was. And she just laughed. She just started laughing, and she said, "Only you Americans ask us that. We are Cuban." And totally coincidentally, 2 weeks ago, Larry's son-in-law got his DNA from Ancestry.com. And Antonio Rubiera is Larry's son-in-law. He came over on the 1980 Mariel boat lift. But Tony got his DNA, and historically from the nation of Cuba, when Spain came to Cuba, as happened in the United States, they brought diseases and had mortal arguments with the people of Cuba. So there are no indigenous people in Cuba. So where did they come from? They came from Spain, and they came from Africa when the Spaniards started their sugar plantations and tobacco plantations. They needed labor, so the slave trade. So Tony is 7% African, 33% Spanish from the Iberian Peninsula, and even 2% Native American. So it was perfect timing that he got that information. One of our last things that we did was to visit a fishing village in Kojimar. It's a cooperative of 187 privately owned boats. This was the village that Hemingway hung out and played dominoes, drank rum, and listened to stories. And his favorite person that he visited was Gregorio Fuentes, who was his inspiration for The Old Man and the Sea. But the government expects a certain catch of fish based on the size of the boat, and they come to pick up
the fish every day. Not all of those 187 boats are exactly seaworthy at all times. They may go out 6 miles from shore by day and 3 miles by night. The fishermen had lunch with us and explained to us that not all of their catch goes to the government, that they manage to feed their families as well. At each meal, we were allowed 2 beverages, and some of the fishermen kind of elbowed us when we only ordered 1 beverage and asked us to get our second one as a soft drink that they could take home to their kids. We also went to Hemingway's home when we went back to Havana, and this is his dining room, and the dining room is always set for 3 people because he was ready for somebody to stop by and have dinner with.
Hemingway's the other side of the artist, an artist who did very well. He was a very wealthy man. And as you know, he was American, and we know him for living in Miami. But Hemingway always said that Cuba was his true home. And he was kind of forced out by the revolution, being as wealthy as he was, and felt he couldn't live there anymore. So he and his wife Mary moved to Idaho, where, as you know, he took his own life. He said he would never get over leaving Cuba.
Our last dinner, after our last dinner, our tour guide said, "We have a problem. The bus broke down." And actually, she planned it. And after we had seen all these classic cars, she lined up classic cars for all of us to go back to our hotel for our last night. Cuba has a Malecón, which is kind of like Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, and it was a beautiful night to drive home. This was our group on one side of the bay looking over at the main city of Havana. It was a wonderful group. We all got along and had a wonderful time. But we are reminded that Cuba is not a land of the free. There are no pleasure boats in Cuba. There are no sailboats in Cuba. If any come, we saw no harbors other than the fishing village. Cubans are not allowed to get on a sailboat. So the Cuban people very much look forward to having expanded relations with the United States, and so do we.